I'm very delighted to be here. I have wanted to come to this gathering for some years. I'm glad I said that, because if I hadn't said that and everyone had just started coming forward, it would have felt strange. Once I was giving a talk in Breckenridge, Colorado, and behind me was just a wall of windows. And in the middle of my talk, the entire room rushed me because there was a giant bear had suddenly appeared, which I, of course, couldn't see because my back was to the window. Anyway. I'm just going to self-promotingly correct one thing from the introduction, which was otherwise lovely and wonderful. Wearing God is not my latest book. My latest book came out 2 days ago. Yay! I'll be reading from it tonight at 5 o'clock after my workshop. So if anyone just is a glutton for punishment and has not gotten enough of me, I'm very excited. This is a book I've been working on in some ways for like 15 years, and I'm really excited it's out. But I am also very excited about the topic and material that went into this book, Wearing God, which is about the landscape of metaphorical language, figurative language for God in the scriptures. And I got interested in this topic very much out of a place in my own spiritual life. I became a Christian about 20 years ago. I grew up Jewish, and I had a somewhat dramatic conversion, not like dateable. I cannot tell you that I became a Christian at 10:03 in the morning on January 2nd, 1998. But I had a conversion that sort of unfolded over several years when I was in college, but was in its way quite dramatic and quite wrenching. And then I had this just intense, palpable sense of the nearness of Jesus. For some years as a new Christian, it really felt to me like Jesus was kind of always right alongside me. And I was young, I was in my early 20s, and I mistakenly thought that this is what it would just be like forever. I didn't know much about life at all, but I certainly didn't know much about the choreography of the Christian spiritual life, so I didn't yet know that one thing we can say for sure about the Christian spiritual life is that we very rarely get to stay in a place of stasis with God forever and ever. So new seasons unfolded in my spiritual life. I ultimately found myself in a season maybe 6, 7, 8 years after I became a Christian of feeling quite far away from God, and that season lasted a while, a good long while, like multiple years. And as I emerged from that sort of second season, that season of feeling very far away from God, I realized that my imagination of who God is was fairly limited. That I basically thought of Jesus as some combination of my boyfriend and a wise college professor. Now, these are not terrible ways of thinking of God in and of themselves. In fact, they're pretty biblical, right? The Bible uses erotic language to describe our relationship with the Lord, marital language, erotic language, the Song of Songs. So Jesus is my boyfriend, has some biblical precedent. And wise college professor, Jesus is a teacher, so it's not unbiblical to think of Jesus as a sage professorial type. But I realized in my own life that these images of God just weren't really going to go the distance. They weren't going to carry me through what I hoped would be decades and decades more on this side of eternity of life with God. And so I began to wonder what the scriptures might have to say about this. Did the scriptures, in fact, offer me and my imagination images of God, language for God, metaphors for God that went beyond wise college professor and boyfriend? And lo and behold, there are like 9,017 different metaphors for God in the scriptures. That's not an exact figure, but it's ballpark. So what I'm going to talk about for the next half an hour, I'm hoping to briefly dip into 4 baskets of metaphorical language for God in the scriptures, And if I can get through them all, I'm hoping to talk about 2 baskets of metaphorical language that are not much talked about in the church. And then I want to look at 2 of our more familiar baskets of language for God that are commonly engaged in our hymns and our prayers and our visual art, and see if we can't crack open some complex layers of meaning. And I want to say 2 more words of preface before I get into these 4 metaphors and images. The first is, you will notice that the 4 metaphors and images for God that I'm talking about are very ordinary, and they're very much part of our everyday lives. So there are metaphors for God in the Bible that don't have very much to do with our daily lives in 21st century North America, like king. I don't know any kings. I have never lived under a king yet. And so I don't bring to God is my king, I don't bring like a vast trove of autobiographical experience. The images that I'm going to talk about this afternoon mostly are images that are connected at least to some of our daily lives in some way, shape, or form. And there's a deep invitation here, and I think the invitation is this. We bring to the Bible an archive of interpretive knowledge. And we bring that archive of interpretive knowledge whether or not we've ever taken a college-level Old Testament class, whether or not we've ever read a Bible commentary. We bring an archive of our own autobiographical knowledge. So when God compares God's self in Hosea to a giant cypress tree, you might not know anything about cypresses, I don't, but you probably know something about large trees. And you might have had experience with large trees. You might have had experience climbing them or sitting under them or looking out your window at them. And so you already know something about how God is self-disclosing to us in scriptures because you have this archive within your own life experience. When God identifies God's self as bread, you know something about bread. So I want to suggest that there's an emboldening invitation here to draw on your own knowledge of the everyday things to which God compares God's self in Scripture. And then the second sort of framing invitation is that I think attention to these metaphors for God in the Bible makes going through a day on the planet a whole lot more interesting. I have this gorgeous magnolia tree outside my kitchen window. And it's one thing to look at the tree and think, that is a beautiful tree created by God. It's more interesting to look at it and think, that is a beautiful giant tree, and God has proclaimed that God is a tree. So that means that tree, if I ask it nicely and I listen attentively, might have something to show me about who God is. Just a much more interesting way of looking out the window. And this, by the way, is of course not my method. It's the method of Jesus, who taught, it seems to me, by simply going through an ordinary Tuesday or an ordinary Thursday and looking around his world and grabbing something, pointing to something, guys lining up to get their paycheck, or a sparrow, or a woman kneading some bread dough, and he would point to these everyday things and say, you think that this is just a line of guys waiting for their paycheck, or you think this is just a sparrow. It isn't. It is also a basket of clues about what the kingdom of God is like, and therefore what God is like. So we're just pressing in to Jesus's own invitation to us to attend to the ways that the things in our world and our everyday lives can show us something about who God is. So I'm going to start with an image that appears pretty early in the Bible. It appears in Genesis 3. Where are we in Genesis 3? The cosmos has been created. The situation with the tree has occurred and the serpent. Eve has eaten the quince or the apple and shared it with Adam, and they've realized that they're naked, and they've grabbed some fig leaves to try to do something about that. And they are about to be ushered out of Eden. Some consequences have been pronounced. Some things that will happen next have been pronounced. Toiling by the sweat of the brow, pain in childbirth, separation from God. And they are indeed about to leave the garden. And God says in Genesis 3, I will do one more thing for Adam and Eve before they leave the garden. The text tells us that God made for Adam and his wife garments of skin. God made for Adam and his wife garments of skin. Now, I've known the Adam and Eve story since I was a little kid, and until fairly recently, I thought that what that meant was that God gave Adam and Eve their skin, their dermis, at that moment. Now, if you'd asked me what I thought they looked like before this happened, I'm not totally sure that I know what I would have said. I have a new doctor. I was recently in the doctor's office. You know how some doctors still have those transparencies that have like the cutaways of the human body, the nervous system, the skeletal system, the musculature system? I think I would have said they looked like the muscle cutaway in your doctor's office. And I just thought this is what the verse meant. Well, it turns out this is not the dominant interpretation of the verse. Most readers, not all, but most readers, rabbinic and Christian, Jewish and Christian, have said what this verse means is that God made Adam and Eve some leather outfits, garments of animal skin, rabbit fur coats, leather dresses and trousers, to replace their itchy and sort of ineffective fig leaf situations. So this is a really arresting image, I think. God knelt over a sewing machine, stitching some leather outfits for Adam and Eve. And it really, when you stop thinking about it, it really is one of the earliest images or metaphors, bits of figurative imagery we get for God in the Bible. We're only in Genesis 3, so what do we have? God is the creator, we've got that. Arguably, God is a gardener, because what God creates includes centrally this garden, and God seems really invested in the garden being well cared for. God seems invested in the flourishing of the garden. We've gotten God as a walker, right? Genesis 3 also tells us that Adam overheard the sound of the Lord God walking in the cool of the evening breeze in the Garden of Eden, which I just think is the coolest image, the idea that God takes an evening stroll in the Garden of Eden. And then we get this moment where God makes leather outfits for Adam and Eve, which I think is an invitation from the scriptures to imagine God as a tailor or a seamstress. Has anyone here ever made any clothing? Hands up high. A whole lot of people. Have you made clothing more for yourself or more for other people? Or both? Both, okay. So we have some experience here. If you have made clothing, particularly if you've made clothing for other people, you know some things about the character and identity of God from your own life experience that those of us who have not made clothing don't know. And I made one skirt once in 8th grade. I have talked at length to people who have made clothing pretty regularly for other people, or people who have the experience of having clothing made for them. And those conversations have really shown me something about what this story might be suggesting about the character and identity of God. So when I ask people, how do you feel about the people you make clothing for? No one has ever said, I feel really angry at them, and then I make some clothes. I've never heard that response. I almost always hear, I make clothing for people I love. I make a baptismal gown for my newborn, or I make clothing for my kids, or I knit a sweater for my wife. I make clothing for people I love, and it's an offering of love, which really, for me, shakes up how I think of what's going on at this moment in Genesis 3, because usually my caricature that I bring to the text is God is really enraged at this moment. Adam and Eve have been disobedient, God is angry, God is punishing them and sending them out of the garden, but the text does not actually say that God is enraged. The text says God made some clothing for them, right? This one last gift that God could give them before they left. I imagine it's a moment of love. It might also be a moment of sorrow that the seamstress God, the tailor God in Genesis 3 is saying, yes, you do actually have to leave now, but I'm going to do this one last thing for you before you go. I had a long conversation recently with a woman who herself was not a seamstress, but her mother was. And this was a woman in her 70s. And her mother had made all of the clothing for this woman and her siblings, for 20 years. Mom had made all the clothing. And one of the things the woman said to me about this clothing that her mother made, she said there was always extra fabric, there were always extra big hems, so that the clothing could be let out as we grew. And I love that as a picture of God's provision for us, that stitched into the fabric of the gifts that God gives us is the expectation that we will grow and that we will change shape and size, and the gifts God gives us maybe have extra wide hems so that those hems can be let out and the gifts will continue to fit us as we grow and change. And in those gifts is the expectation that we will grow, the presumption that we will grow. One more little bit of cultural data about seamstressing and tailoring that has helped me interpret this verse comes from the movie Phantom Threads. Did anyone see this movie? It came out like a year and a half ago, a couple of people. This was sadly, supposedly, Daniel Day-Lewis's last movie. Daniel Day-Lewis actually figures in my conversion story, which I can tell you later. So Daniel Day-Lewis is a central figure in my spiritual life. And in this movie, Phantom Thread, Day-Lewis plays a very much in demand dressmaker in the 1950s. And he has this habit of stitching barely visible phrases into the hems of the dresses he makes. He makes ball gowns and wedding gowns for princesses and for, the high society of Europe. And he stitches phrases barely visibly into the hems. For example, he is commissioned to make a wedding dress, I believe for a princess, and he stitches in lavender thread the phrase, "never cursed." I like to think of God stitching "never cursed" into the hems of the leather outfits that God makes for Adam and Eve. In the review of Phantom Thread by A.O. Scott in the New York Times, Scott focused on these phantom phrases that the Daniel Day-Lewis character stitched into his clothing. And A.O. Scott observed, those phrases transformed the dresses that Day-Lewis made from luxury consumer goods into works of art. And specifically, wrote A.O. Scott, those little phrases that were stitched in obscurely yet unmistakably saturated the clothing with the passions and personalities of its creator. Obscurely yet unmistakably saturated the dresses with the passions and personalities of their creator, which I think is a wonderful lens through which to think about God's creation not only the clothing that the seamstress God, the dressmaker God, the tailor God made for Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, but all of God's creation, including but not limited to us, that we are obscurely yet unmistakably saturated with the passions and personalities of the Creator. So God as seamstress, God as tailor, the first image I want to offer to us. And if we had all weekend, we could follow that thread, no pun intended, through the scriptures. Clothing, once you see this central role of clothing in Genesis 3, you start noticing clothing, literal and metaphorical clothing, all through the Bible. And it's a very interesting basket of imagery to follow. And if you follow it into the New Testament, you come to the Apostle Paul, who identifies God not as a clothes maker, but as clothing, when Paul says that those of us who are baptized are clothed in Jesus. So the clothing metaphor is very rich and very expansive. And I think it's a way more interesting way to think about the stuff in my closet when I think that the Apostle Paul has identified Jesus with clothing. Anyway, we don't have all weekend. So I'm going to move on to a second basket of imagery. A second basket of imagery that I'm very taken with in the scriptures is imagery that has to do with sensory perception. Sensory perception. So the biblical writers, you might have noticed, can be terse. They sometimes don't give us kinds of literary details that we're accustomed to in our text in the 21st century. They don't always give us psychological or emotional details that we might want. But intriguingly, many of the biblical writers spill a fair amount of ink giving sensory perception details. They don't just say that someone came to know something. They say that a character in the Bible saw something or heard something or tasted something or touched something. And usually in the scriptures, when you see language of the sensorium, language of the senses, it usually has a literal register, I saw something, and a metaphorical register. For instance, in the Old Testament, when you see language of sight, it very often is language that is intended also to imply that when a person sees something, she entails an obligation to respond to what she saw. So, for example, in the Joseph story, it is when Joseph sees that his brothers are suffering that he realizes he has an obligation to respond. So, sensory language often has many layers in the scriptures. What I want to talk about for a few minutes is not the language of sight, but the language of smell. Because God in the Bible is depicted as smelling in both senses of the term. Perceiving odor and emitting odor. In Ephesians, we read that the offering and sacrifice that Jesus is on the cross emits a pleasing scent or a savory scent or a savory and sweet-smelling scent. Translations are very interestingly different on this. But we are told that Jesus on the cross emits a pleasing smell, which is strange and presumably metaphorical, though Jesus' body did all kinds of other weird things like rise from the dead, so maybe it emitted a pleasing smell while being killed by the Roman state also. And early church writers picked up this language in Ephesians, and they gave, the early church writers were into giving Jesus all kinds of nicknames. Ancient writers did that all the time, swift-footed Achilles and so forth. So some of the nicknames given to Jesus had to do with his pleasant fragrance that he emitted. Jesus is described in the early church as a treasury of perfumes and as a basket or bouquet of sweet-smelling lilies. So God emits a fragrance, but much more frequently in the scriptures, God is described as perceiving fragrance, as smelling in terms of perceiving a scent. Some 40 or so times in the Old Testament, there's this two-word Hebrew phrase that is usually translated as something like soothing odor or soothing scent. And it is a phrase that appears when the Old Testament is describing certain sacrifices that Israel offers to God, primarily, almost exclusively, though not exclusively, incense sacrifices. That Israel would offer an incense sacrifice and it would emit a soothing odor, and the Lord would perceive this soothing scent and accept the sacrifice. Now, I find this language very intriguing. Has anyone ever tried to read the whole Bible straight through from the beginning to the end? Hands, please. Has anyone failed? Okay. Did you get bogged down in Leviticus by chance? Yeah. So, Leviticus is actually a super interesting book. The legal code, actually the legal codes are super interesting. Maybe Jim and I will have a chance to talk about that in our Q&A. I will not digress. But actually, I do love Leviticus. But it's reasonable to get bogged down in the legal codes and in the detailed descriptions of the sacrifices that you find in the middle of the books of Moses in Leviticus. And I find reading about the sacrifices pretty confusing and pretty difficult because my entire spiritual life, my whole way of communicating with God basically happens in verbal and silent prayer. Verbal and silent prayer, those are the things I primarily know to do to snuggle up and get close to the Lord. Sacrificing some quail is not something I know how to do to get close to God. Making a sacrifice. And so I just don't really know how to interpret or how to think about these passages in the Old Testament about the sacrificial system, except when I get to these incense sacrifices that emit a soothing scent. There is a scholar at the University of Oregon named Deborah Green who has written an entire book about scent and smell in the Old Testament and in rabbinic literature. And she says that these incense offerings were a kind of divine aromatherapy. They calmed God down. They appeased God's anger. And they thereby made God available for a moment of particularly intense communion with the people. And when I read Deborah Green spelling this out, I realized that this even makes a literal idiomatic sense. If you look at the Hebrew, one of the biblical Hebrew phrases to describe intense anger is a phrase that literally means he had a flared nose. He flared his nostrils, is the idiomatic way in biblical Hebrew of saying he was really angry. And one of the idioms for he had calmed down and gotten over his anger, to be calm, is to literally in the Hebrew have a long face or a long nose. Your nose that you have flared in anger has gotten unscrunched. So it makes a kind of sense that it would be scent, a soothing odor that would appease God's anger, that would function in this sort of divine aromatherapy way. And I can make sense of this because although I don't have experience of sacrificing quails to the Lord or pigeon doves, I do have experience of being soothed by scent. Lavender, I'm a lifelong insomniac. I spray lavender sheet spray on my pillows. It calms me down. Or coming home at night after a long day at work and someone magically has cooked a pot of soup and you smell the soup when you walk in the door and it just soothes you and calms you. So I have some experience from my own life of being soothed by scent. So I can imagine God also being soothed by scent. It's interesting that the scriptures are so interested in God perceiving smell because contemporary neuroscientists have said that smell is uniquely connected, uniquely intimate with our emotional processing. All kinds of sensory perceptions, sight, sound, touch, can trigger emotional responses in us. But contemporary neuroscience finds that smell triggers emotional responses more quickly and more lastingly than other kinds of sensory perception. And one particular kind of emotional response that human beings have to smell is something that psychologists call olfactory comfort. Olfactory comfort. And this olfactory or smelling comfort is specifically the kind of comfort you feel when you have been separated from someone you love, and then you smell the person's scent. And the person's smell calms the distress that you feel about the person's absence. So this is why when your beloved might be out of town, you might sleep in his shirt because you want the scent. It's why a nurse in Minnesota invented and patented a garment that is half shirt and half baby blanket. And new mothers are to wear this garment a few hours before they are going to have to be separated from the baby. And the garment picks up their scent, and right before they leave to go to work or go out on a date or whatever it is they're doing, they wrap the baby up in this blanket, and the child is calmed in her distress by the smell of her mother. So smell has this particular capacity to comfort us when we are distraught by a loved one's absence. And I am struck when I am in the scriptures by that moment in Revelation where the prayers of the saints are described as incense rising to God from golden bowls. The prayers of the saints are incense rising to God in golden bowls, which I think suggests that our prayers have a scent, have the soothing scent of an incense offering. And maybe that isn't only about appeasing God's anger. Maybe our prayers offer God some olfactory comfort, which is a reminder that God is in fact deeply distraught and deeply grieved by our absence. And what can soothe God in God's divine distress about our absence is the soothing scent of our prayers as they rise like so much incense from the golden bowls that are our bodies. And I think the singing Quakers give us actually a particularly striking, vivid illustration of that. I'm going to just look briefly at one more image because the clock down there tells me I have 7 minutes. And that is the image of shepherd. So we've looked at God as seamstress, God as smelling. Those are images that we don't pay a huge amount of attention to usually in the life of the church. I don't know any church called Church of the Good Seamstress, Church of the Soothed Smeller. But there are plenty of churches called Church of the Good Shepherd. So shepherd is one of these images that we've actually lifted up in the church and enshrined, and we talk about all the time. We might have a Good Shepherd stained glass window in our church. We might have Good Shepherd Sunday, on which kids in Sunday school are making little sheep made from toilet paper rolls and cotton balls. We read the 23rd Psalm, and we read Jesus in the Gospel of John declaring, "I am the Good Shepherd," and we know what we're supposed to think that means. Jesus is depicted in all these stained glass windows as being sort of brawny and broad-shouldered, and he's standing there with his sheep, and he is the shepherd who goes after the one sheep, and we know to come to his voice. It's not actually that interesting an image, really, when you think about it, but we've enshrined it. And in fact, it is an interesting image. I just think we don't attend to it in particularly interesting ways. One of the frustrations with the centrality of the shepherding image is that most of us in 21st century America are not intimately acquainted with shepherding. So we can mine our own experiences of aromatherapy or of sewing, and we can get somewhere pretty quickly. What might this mean about God? Well, I can mine my own experience and think about that. But if you ask me to mine my own experience about shepherding and then ask who God is, I more or less draw a blank. I am not a shepherd. I'm not sure I've ever been within like 20 yards of an actual sheep. And I only know one shepherd. I know a shepherd named Catherine. I've met her twice. She lives in Washington State. I met Catherine for the first time About 5 years ago, I had just accepted the call to be the part-time vicar of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lewisburg, and I was very excited to have this call, and I was completely terrified because I was pretty sure that I didn't know what I was doing and I was going to fail at this job. And I flew out to Seattle to give some lectures at a church there, and a woman from the church picked me up at the airport, was driving me into Seattle. She was telling me about the church. And she said, on our church, we have 3 pastors on staff. Pastor X oversees our outreach into the city, those ministries. Pastor Y does young adult formation and young families. And Pastor Catherine is a shepherd. And I said, it is so helpful for me to hear you say that about Pastor Catherine. And I explained that I'd just taken this job and I'd only been a priest for 2 years and I didn't really know what I was doing. And I said, if 5 years from now, if someone from St. Paul's Lewisburg says Vicar Lauren is a shepherd, then I will feel like I have really learned how to be these people's priest and how to be their pastor. I'm so thankful that you said that about Pastor Catherine. That's very helpful for me to hear. And the woman said, no, Catherine really is a shepherd. And I said, exactly. See, if that is what they are saying about me in 5 years, Vicar Lauren really is a shepherd, I will know that I have really become a priest. And the woman said, no, Pastor Catherine lives on an island off the coast of Seattle on a sheep farm. And she gets up every morning and tends her sheep and then hops on her motorcycle and motorcycles to the ferry and takes the ferry into Seattle and comes to her day job at the church. So now when we read Jesus proclaiming, I am the good shepherd, from the Gospel of John, I picture Pastor Catherine on her motorcycle. I give you that image of Pastor Catherine to put alongside whatever stained glass window image you have of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And I also give you the image that you picked up when you came in. I give you this image to put alongside your image of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. This photograph ran in The Guardian, a British newspaper, about 10 years ago. They did a spread of photographs called Shepherds Around the World, and this was one of about 10 photographs. This is in Abbottabad, Pakistan. That's where the bin Laden compound was. And this girl, I don't know, she looks like she's maybe 6 or 7 or 5 or young girl, and she's leading these sheep. There is a man in the background, and I don't know if he's related or he just happened to walk into the picture, or maybe he's her father, maybe he owns these sheep. This girl is doing the work of shepherding. And when I saw this picture in The Guardian, I was completely captivated by it. I just think she's adorable. But I was also incredibly confused because what is a 7-year-old girl doing working as a shepherd? So then I started to do some digging. And I learned that in many communities around the world, shepherding is actually work given to young girls. In some communities in Bolivia, in some Bedouin communities, and apparently in some communities in Pakistan, shepherding is work done by young girls. And once I learned that about Pakistan and Bolivia, I realized that in some way I had already known it, because I knew that even in the history of the church, I knew there were people that we call shepherdesses. I had just never honestly really connected shepherdesses with actual shepherding. I don't know what I thought it meant. I mean, I knew it had something to do with shepherding, but I just didn't bring together Joan of Arc was a shepherdess before she was Joan of Arc. Saint Genevieve, who was famous for feeding the poor during the siege of Paris, was a shepherdess before she was Saint Genevieve. And then I realized not only are there girl shepherds in church history, there are girl shepherds in the Bible. And I will close by reintroducing you to some of them briefly from Exodus 2. In Exodus 2, we read that a priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. but some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered the flock. And Moses marries one of them, Zipporah. So here is a biblical depiction of young women shepherding, taking their father's flock to be watered. And I think not only is this a depiction of girl shepherds, I think it's the Bible's earliest depiction of workplace sexual harassment. Here are these women coming to their shepherd workplace, and some male shepherds do not want them around and try to drive them off. And Moses, an ally, intervenes. So I give you that picture from Exodus 2 and this picture to ponder next time you are hanging out with Jesus, the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd is, no doubt, the broad-shouldered, brawny, stained glass window Jesus, the strong Jesus, the protective Jesus. But this image, I think, is also an image of profound vulnerability and risk. Those daughters of the priest of Midian were in harm's way as young women shepherds, and I have to think that this little girl is also doing something that is very vulnerable and very exposing and very risky. And of course, that's true of, when we press into them, every image we have of Jesus. Jesus uniquely always holds together true perfect strength with true risk, exposure, and vulnerability. But to say it like that is to say it like a platitude that no one really listens to, whereas to say, I am the Good Shepherd, I am the Good Shepherd who is identified with those daughters of the priest of Midian in Exodus 2 and this girl in Abbottabad, Pakistan in 2008, is to say something else.